Hey guys, real quick, if you are listening to me on YouTube, thank you, appreciate the support, but please feel free to check out Your One Black Friend across other platforms as well. I am available on Spotify, Apple, Google platform, and Amazon, your favorite podcast listeners. And this also allows you to speed through the information a little bit faster if I'm speaking too slowly, especially for super awesome episodes like this one, which tend to be a little bit longer, but the information is dense. And I promise you'll be absolutely excited at the end of the episode that you listened all the way through. So I'm trying to make your listening experiences a little bit easier. And I definitely encourage you to listen on the podcast platform, your favorite podcast platform. You can find me anywhere. All right. Enjoy the show. Hey, how are you guys doing? I hope all is well. I hope this episode finds you well. Apologies. It's been a while since I put out an episode, partially intentional. One, because the previous episode I felt like it was very important and needed to be listened to, because there were a lot of ideas that were presented that were paradigm shifting, thought provoking, kind of the nature of a podcast. And my hope was that people would listen to it, who'd never listened to the podcast before, and that the episode would sort of expand their perception, not only of reality, but also of themselves and who they really are. And two, I have been traveling. So I've been out of the country, just got back a couple of days ago, now finally getting settled in. And while I may not have been able to put out episodes while traveling, I certainly have been busy reading and taking in information, which I always share with you, my beautiful friends. Now, this episode is going to present some information having to do with the myth of Genesis. And I apologize by using the word myth, and I don't mean that in an offensive way if, you consider yourself Christian. Although I feel like if you've been listening to my previous episodes, you guys kind of get it, and I don't think the preamble is necessary. But I study mythology, theology, religion, more from a historical perspective rather than a religious perspective or spiritual perspective. Because I think from that kind of mindset, we can fill in some holes about the nature of our reality and help understand this world a little bit better. And so when I say the word myths, particularly in relation to the book of Genesis, I need you to kind of understand that, 1,000 years from now or 2,000 years from now, people will view biblical works the way we view Homer's Iliad or any writings about, the Greeks and the ancient Romans, right? So 2,000 years ago, the ancient Greeks and Romans clearly had the same reverence for their gods. Like, they took their religion and their religious stories and their holy books seriously in the same way that modern practitioners of religions do. There was an air of reverence around their holy books. And not just the Greeks and the Romans, but also, the Norse, Middle Easterners and things of that nature. But as people who believed in Zeus and Hera or Thor and Loki sort of died out, their religion was replaced by a new religion. And, the reverence around these mythical gods and goddesses sort of faded away as humanity sort of grew through time. So this is why I approach any religious writing with that historical mindset, because if you took a person from from Iceland or whatever, and put them in a time machine. Let's put them in a TARDIS, and you brought them to our time, and you showed them a story of the Avengers, right? To see Thor and Odin and Loki sort of being made into caricatures. I don't know if they would take it lightly, and as lightly as we do. We've turned people's gods into cartoon characters, people's, religious beliefs, into cartoon characters, into forms of entertainment. And so all I'm attempting to do is essentially project you guys 2,000 years into the future, where the reverence around our present, religious sort of ideology, prevailing religious ideology, no longer has that much of a hold on the minds of people. Yeah. Because whatever you want to believe, at the end of the day, I'm sorry, that too will pass, right? That sort of sense of holiness will pass, and new religions will come up as they've always done. And every civilization, every society believes that their gods are the right gods, and everybody else's god, and gods are pagan. My background, I am of African descent. My original nationality is Nigerian. My mother is Igbo, and my dad is Edo. Yeah. So they had gods, pre-Christian gods, right? The Igbos believed in like the Mamiwata and Chi, and I'm not terribly familiar with what the Edo believed in prior to the influence of Islam and Christianity as well. But obviously, my ancestors believed something completely different than what people in that region now practice, or I should say, what a lot of the people in that region practice today, which is, Christianity and Islam, right? So it happens. And if you're familiar with, for example, the Epic of Gilgamesh, right, and the beliefs back in that Fertile Crescent, the Middle East, right, they believed in the gods like Inanna and things like that. And now, they're largely, Arabic, and so they believe in Muhammad. So things change. And the nature of this podcast is, right, thought-provoking, expanding your mind and getting you to look at things differently. I'm not saying you have to agree with everything that I say. And I would argue that the majority of people who listen to me don't agree with everything that I say. And I would take it a step further and say I don't even agree or believe or accept everything that I say. So everything I say is subject to change as I come across more information. And I, in this present moment, have come across some information now that is interesting and I would like to share with you. So let's take the story of Genesis, not a religious, but more from a stance of mythos, right? And we're going to take a theological approach to it, yeah? We're going to talk about the two creation stories in the book of Genesis. Two creation stories in the book of Genesis. Two creation stories in the book of Genesis. A lot of people don't realize that it's two creation stories in the book of Genesis. So the first chapter, right? If you compare the first chapter to, I believe, the second chapter, or I should say the first creation story to the second creation story, and historians have done so, the writing style is different. There's a certain level of math that is sort of writ in the first creation story, and it's more of a story of the gods, plural, Elohim, yeah? Plural, the gods, shaping, and I've argued in previous episodes, terraforming a formless earth, right? So if you read between the lines, or if you just read it with an open mind that's not blinded by misinterpretations, you'll see the first story basically says that the gods, Elohim, happened across Earth, right? The planet Earth. And three things existed when the gods discovered Earth. One, Earth, right? Two, darkness, right? And three, water. Okay, so go back. You don't have to own a Bible. You can Google this, but go back and read it, and read that first, and you'll see that there were three things, right? And then there have been scholars, one in particular, I believe her name was Ellen Van Wold, who have said that where it says in the beginning the gods created, it actually meant separated. And so the word created being used now as our modern understanding of the word created is actually a misinterpretation or a mistranslation. It actually means separated. Now, I have looked at both sides of the argument, and of course there are people who want to believe that Genesis, especially the first chapter, talks about a God that created everything out of nothing. And so their challenge to that is, no, you're wrong, right? Because, one, they sort of negate the fact that the original language in which it was written doesn't speak of a singular God. It speaks of Elohim, plural, so multiple gods. And I'm going to delve into that a little bit further. So they kind of throw that away because they want to believe that their religion is the only religion that believes in a all-powerful, singular, monotheistic God, right? Who created everything out of nothing. Okay. But one, that's not the case, right? Two, anthropologists and historians alike agree that in that region, the Near East, all of the so-called pagans, and by pagans, I mean basically the non-Judaic belief systems, which that word is sort of disgusting if you think about it, really, right? Because they're even hidden in that word is a sense of hierarchy. Is to say that, this religion is the chosen religion and everybody else's religion is, quote, pagan, right? Or, just not the right one. So being mindful around that word. But all of the spiritual, religious practices in the Near East, in that region where the story of Genesis arrived, or I should say was found, came forth from, they none of them believed, one, in a God that creates everything out of nothing. Every single religion in that area specifically, their origin stories, their creation stories tell of their variant gods creating the world out of things that were already there. And they all kind of report the same thing, a separation from, separating the heavens from the earth. All the same thing. Take it a step further. Even the Chinese origin stories have the same sort of recurring themes. Separation from, separation of the earth and the sky, right? The firmament. They have that. And also the breathing of God into human form to bring life. Okay. So, and I'm going to get back to that, but not only just in China, but also in Greece, in Ireland as well. Those same recurrent themes. So bear in mind that a lot of things get sort of lost in translation or sort of change through time. What I mean by that, for example, if you listen to English now, and I think there's a video, somebody on TikTok did this, and you can probably find this on YouTube as well. If you take the English language and you go back in time, like just 400, 500 years, you're going to have a hard time understanding what the hell the person is talking about, because just in 500 years or even 300 years, the language changes so much. Even now, right, that you can see there's a generational shift between, like, let's say people who we call boomers and let's say people that are, Gen Z or whatever. The way they speak is different. Give it 100 years and that's going to be, that's going to be a significant change. If you watch movies from like the 1920s, right, there's like this way they talk, see, right? Like that whole thing. Yeah. It's just different. And then you take it back, to, let's say, the 1600s, and it's a lot of these and those and all of that. You guys catch my drift. So, like modern sort of translators, okay, and bear in mind that even translations are subjective. They're not objective. It's up to the interpreter what they think a certain word means. So a lot of people are building like premises and belief systems based on, a translator's personal interpretation of word or words. And some people have argued too, well, a lot of these other scholars agree. Okay, yeah, that's fine. But that doesn't mean that a large group of people can't agree on something that is wrong, right? For example, there was a time when people all agreed that what took out the dinosaurs was asteroids, right? But now it is being taught that it may not have been, this is being taught now in colleges, that it may not have been the asteroids, right? It might have been volcanoes, I guess. Volcanoes erupting simultaneously across the earth and shooting out ash and soot and all of that and blocking the sun and creating I guess a film or layer, and that was what caused the ice age and the dinosaurs to die. Okay, so just because a bunch of people believe that or think that, Genesis, for example, describes a singular God creating everything out of nothing, doesn't make it true. One, because of the fact that even in the first chapter, it's kind of a giveaway that there's an issue in translation there, because that God says, let us, and I'm very specific when I say that God, I'm saying that for a reason. That God says, let us create man in our image. Yeah. And it's funny because I'll go and I'll read like what people say about the fact that there's plural being used. God said, let us create mankind in our image. And the mental gymnastics that people kind of put themselves through to just avoid the simple fact, avoid acknowledging the fact that when this book was written, the ancient Semites, the ancient Hebrews, ancient Israelites, and before that, who wrote this, this work, did not believe in a monotheistic God. That came later. That came with the Council of Nicaea. That came with, the Roman involvement. Yeah, that was a corruption. If you look back in time, that was not the case. But people don't, you want to place your belief, you want to believe something, but you're not going to take the time. If it was like, if we lived in the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, even any time before, like, let's say, early 1990s, I guess, where, with the emergence of internet, where you couldn't just Google shit or buy a book and find out, like, literally, you don't have to, you can buy a book in an instant with Audible, with Kindle, with, anything, or you can go on YouTube and research this stuff yourself. It would make sense to kind of hold on to a particular, mindset that is false. But with the advent of, with us being in the information age, to continue to hold steadfast to a belief that it's just flawed, is kind of goofy. And excuse me, I don't mean that to be disrespectful. I can't find another word for that. So that within itself, that breakdown tells you that the original writing describes Elohim, plural. It was multiple gods. So just take that, and even if there's a contradiction there where it says, I said, let us create these two entities, mankind and man and woman, in my image. How would that make any sense? All right. Or I said, I just kind of, I wasn't even able to complete the sentence properly, because even within saying it, it doesn't make any sense. Right. I said, I want to create, I'm an artist, I'm a painter. Okay. So I said, I want to paint a man and woman in my image. And then I go, let us paint a man and woman in our image. Okay, you see that doesn't make any sense. Okay, now if I'm with a group of artists and we're about to paint some portraits, right, some paintings, and there's a male present alongside a female, then it would make sense to say, hey, us artists, let us paint some portraits that kind of look like us, right? And then it would make sense for the males to paint men and the females to paint women, right? So the fact that a male and a female is even described and defined in the first chapter should tell you right then and there that something wonky is going on. There's a translation error, and we're insisting on believing in a mistake, but that doesn't, just because you insist on believing in a mistake doesn't mean it's not a mistake. But that within itself tells you that there were females present. Duh. Right? But, we now live in a, patriarchal society, and believing that there was no female involved in the creation of the earth is what kind of keeps patriarchy going. But that is a false premise. It's bullshit, and it's right there in front of your face, whether or not you want to see it. And by you, I don't mean you, the listeners. I just mean people who keep arguing that there was not a female God. Google Asherah, Asherah, Asherah. That was the god's wife, and she was worshipped. I'm sorry, I should say that was the Lord God's wife, right? Yahweh's wife, and she was worshipped on her own, as her own sort of deity, the way people worshipped Hera, Asherah, Zeus, Jesus. I mean, anyway, just kind of, throwing some stuff out there for you guys to think about. But yeah, she was worshipped as her own singular sort of deity before the patriarchy kind of did its thing. So Google is your friend. Now, the reason why I say the Lord God and I differentiate that from Elohim is because, once again, we're dealing with two creation myths in the first and second chapter of Genesis. The first chapter of Genesis absolutely deals with a plural sort of conglomeration of gods, and they are very ordered, and everything is about time, right? And out of chaos, they create order. Okay, so they happened across an earth, right? What are the three things that they found, but they did not create? They found darkness, they found an earth, and they found water. Go back and read it. They found water. It never says that they created water. It says that they moved the water. They separated the water from the land. To me, and I've said this in previous episodes, it reads like, if you look at it from a science fiction or scientific perspective, it reads like terraforming, right? So take that story and twist it a bit and just say, we have these entities, right? And to certain people, they would be considered gods, but they're not, right? They're just technologically advanced entities. They happened across an earth that was formless and void and dark. Who knows what happened before that? Yeah. And then they started terraforming the planet, right? Separating the water. There's even a verse right there. I think the first or second verse or something like that. It talks about a wind, a spirit of God, and the wind moved across the surface of the deep. Every time, even as a kid, whenever I would read that, I would always think of like a spaceship. When a spaceship kind of hovers over water and you can see it kind of, the force of whatever, the spaceship like separating the water, right? And moving it. So that image always came to my mind. And it's still obviously, is in my mind and stays in my mind. And I think that that's an appropriate sort of perception of it. So you have those gods, and they were plural, and they were male and female. And I always imagine like explorers or whatever that come through and do their thing, separate the earth, and then start, bringing forth animals or whatever. And I think a couple episodes prior, I talked about this before. I just like revisiting, kind of building up on it, because why not? But in Michio Kaku's book, The Future of Humanity, he talked about, should we continue down our path, right, of technological change? I won't say evolution, I'll say change. Eventually, we will probably evolve beyond. I just said I won't use evolution, and then I used evolution, but we will probably change and decide that we no longer need our bodies, and then we will become non-corporeal entities. He also stated that in that same book, The Future of Humanity, wormholes are constantly popping through. But the problem is that wormholes are so small that you would only be able to send kind of small bits of information through it. He ended that book basically saying that at the Big Bang, what caused our Big Bang, right, the beginning of this reality, this universe, could have been the end of a previous universe or whatever. And then he theorized that perhaps Noah's Ark sort of situation happened where non-corporeal entities were able to send DNA, and he brings in theories, Francis Crick's panspermia, Google that, panspermia, could bring in the DNA through the wormhole as their universe exploded and this one began, and then finding a planet, searching for and eventually finding a planet conducive to life. And they happened across upon Earth, and Earth was the only planet that had water, and water is obviously life. And then that's when they started sort of terraforming. So imagine, if you will, what we think of now as the Bible, of an oral history of human beings who have had the story of how they came to Earth, right? How humanity began on Earth from another world, from another planet. And that's just been passed from generation to generation. But like that, what's that? I think it's Chinese something or another, Chinese Whispers game, where because it passes and it's an oral story from generation to generation, it changes and changes and changes. And so now we have a literal understanding of something that was meant to be like more figurative and perhaps even metaphorical story, I guess, of how this world was formed. So I always like playing with the idea, like I said, it's like historical perspective, throwing in science on mythological stories. And if you think I'm picking on Christianity, I am not. I actually took the time to also write, you'll hear papers kind of moving around, Theogony, which means the birth of the gods, by Hesiod. I took that story, Theogony, Hesiod's Theogony, and I wrote out a sort of science fiction story based on that. And I applied our science fiction, I applied our modern understanding of warfare, of geography, of space travel and time travel even, to that. And I gave it a different sort of twist. And so that's something that I do for enjoyment. And so I'm not just picking on Christianity. And I would argue you could probably do the same thing for your favorite myths, right? Stop elevating these stories of these gods as whatever these sort of super powerful sort of beings, and start thinking of them more from a scientific approach, right? From a different perspective. Okay, so Genesis 1, let's say Kaku and Crick are right, and this did happen. So they do believe that, what began the Big Bang was something small, which would support the argument of something sort of non-corporeal sort of entity or non-corporeal civilization condensing matter, DNA, condensing it to something minute, yeah? Like, even think about it, like when you like for military people, for example, right, their foods are kind of dehydrated and you add water and it expands, right? So we do take things that will eventually become big, but we kind of to store them and transport them, we make them small. So that concept is not far-fetched at all. So, right, now they get here, the gods Elohim, and they terraform, and it's all very ordered in structure. The creation of light, to me, right, creation of the sun and the stars, that's just physics, right? And it's interesting because in the book of John, for example, it says, in the beginning was the Word. Now, the Word is actually another sort of mistranslation. It actually means logos. And logos is essentially logic. And logic could be broken down to mean science. So in John, where it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, I'm tempted to think of our mathematical universe by Max Tegmark, where he says it's all, our universe is math. Not to take it to like that to that extreme, I would say that our universe is comprised of math because our universe is a simulation. For some reason, he says our universe is math, Tegmark does, and then he like rejects the simulation hypothesis. It's just like people are just like willfully just stuck in a particular point of thinking. And that's not an attack to him. Like, I get it, but like, open your mind. If you can say like everything seems like, where there's code and there's math everywhere, but then to me, it makes sense that obviously something constructed it. It's a construct, but to not be able to take that leap and go, it's a simulation, to stop. Why? Like, what does it take away from you to think that? Anyway, if you take Tegmark and you apply it to John's, right, and you blend the two together, it becomes, and you take the Greek word logos, right, the understanding of what it was. Somehow word became logos, somehow logos became word, but logos is logic, yeah? And logos could also speak to science, right? So in the beginning was the science, right? In the beginning was physics, right? And science was God, right? And science was with God, right? And the gods understood science. So you even remove that whole monotheistic thing for obvious reasons, like I just stated. So in the beginning was the science, was the physics of the gods, right? And the physics of the gods were, with the gods. And physics was God, right? Or was the gods, right? The gods use physics essentially to create this world. You guys with me? Come on now. You guys are with me. I know you're with me. Okay, so then it would make sense, right? So now you have DNA been sent through to a wormhole, the Big Bang, comes to Earth, there's water, starts terraforming stuff, right? Then you have, okay, we need the sun. Yeah, so then boom. Let's use, nuclear fission, right? That's physics, and create the sun. We can create, we're working on that now at CERN, right? Creating black holes, creating wormholes, creating, energy, mini suns, things like that. So that's what we're capable of. I would imagine that a technologically advanced civilization of non-corporeal entities that have moved past needing physical form, which is what we're on the path to doing right now. Almost like looping what our ancestors did. It's all stored in our DNA, right? The information is all stored in our DNA. It's not that far-fetched to say that in the beginning was science. Yeah, in the beginning was physics and science, right? So the firmament and separation, whatever, like if you really take the time to think and to take the time to study what the ancients have professed that was capable. It is physics that we haven't even begun to sort of wrap our minds around, but absolutely possible. Like people have theorized, for example, that the Egyptians have moved, stone with sound, right? With vibrations, right? But that to me is just, even if you're saying, okay, in the beginning was sound, right? Some people have argued in the beginning was sound, vibration. And so you could use vibration if you're scientifically advanced or technologically advanced, at least on the scientific level, you could manipulate matter, alchemy, right? But that's all physics. Okay, so it takes it back to my point. In the beginning was physics and the gods, physics, the magic of the gods, right? What is they're saying? Science and magic become, hard to sort of differentiate after a certain point. I can see the person who I'm trying to paraphrase and quote, but you guys know the phrase, okay? So that's that. So that is one sort of ordered story of how everything came to be, and you can take that as a sort of a story that has been passed on from generation to generation about the origins of mankind. And I would argue the extraterrestrial origins of mankind. Isaac Asimov wrote a story similar. I think it was Asimov. I'm not sure. And I don't even know why I brought it up because I don't remember the title, so I can't even reference it to you. But it was about these sea creatures that were like kind of clones of like scientists, and they were sent down to the sort of ocean. It might not have even been Asimov, but they had taken the form of like sea humanoid, like ocean humanoids or whatever. And then they like had contained within them information about how, the original scientists, who they were and their names, whatever. But over time, the story kind of got lost and constructed, and they were trying to make it to the surface of the ocean because they were ocean sort of entities. And the idea at the end of it that eventually they will walk on land, blah, blah, blah. But that made me think of Genesis, and do with that information what you will. Genesis, the first chapter. To me, it's the opposite, though, right? It's intelligence was sent through non-corporeal entities, came through the wormhole. Non-corporeal meaning non-physical, and they brought along with them the DNA of all the creatures that existed in their dying world, right? And then they began to terraform the earth, and that this place is now like a storehouse for, once again, all of the creatures that existed in their dying world and across all of their planets. I would argue that maybe even millions of years ago, each sort of like continent that we have sort of represented here on Earth was their own separate planet. I've kind of talked about this before. And so as their world died, they sort of brought all the DNA there, and now it's we call, some people say the Earth is a zoo, but I think I don't really accept that. I say throw the zoo sort of connotation away and think of it more of like a storehouse or a bank, right? If your world was about to end, like we do that now even with seed banks, yeah? If the world was about to end, you would pull specimen and creatures to sort of from different continents to kind of preserve, the memory and specimen from all these different things. Maybe not all of it, but as much as you can store, you would save it. In fact, it is happening right now. That is what our scientists do. They do with seeds, they do with plants, they do with specimen, DNA and all of that. So it's not far-fetched at all, right? You just have to think deeper. Okay, so that is what Genesis chapter 1 starts with. And I feel like the first chapter of Genesis is not only, I'm going to say this twice, it's not only more, I think it's older than the second chapter, the second creation story. But I would say that it's also much more like accurate and also much more scientific. Don't take the days as like, don't take the days literally, like, the first day he did this and rested on the Sabbath. Like, don't take, it's metaphor, right? Metaphorical. So it could have been, a span of time or whatever, right? So just take that with a grain of salt and understand when you listen to these books or you read these books that a lot of things get lost in translation, and it's okay to have your open mind and sort of go intuitively with what you think is being described and not taking things literally. Okay, so that's the first one. So as a synopsis, non-corporeal entities came through a wormhole. That's what I believe the first chapter of Genesis is describing. Non-corporeal entities came through a wormhole holding DNA that's comprised of all, like the world that they left, right? And they brought it here. And then they found Earth, right? The only planet in the solar system that had water. And then they began to terraform. Like they came like in a little tiny, spaceship, and then expanded, and then they began to terraform. Now, the most important thing is when they say they created man and woman in the image, right? It's almost like, think about it, like what's in an image. If I created something in my own image, it would be a clone, right? So they cloned themselves in their previous forms, right? So maybe before they came through the wormhole, they made themselves non-corporeal so they could travel weightlessly, right? Travel faster than the speed of light, because what can travel faster than the speed of light? Obviously mass. It has to be something that has no mass, right? So they essentially shed their bodies but kept their DNA, samples of the DNA or whatever. However they could do it. Small enough, though, to kind of escape and come through the wormhole into this world, clone themselves. And then that breath that every single creation story, pretty much, if not, most, if not all creation stories say the same thing. They formed man and woman out of earth. I would argue earth is matter. I would argue earth is a mistranslation, and what they mean was they formed it out of matter. So it was a spirit. It was non-corporeal entities, right? Spirit, something you can't touch, right? That's what the Genesis says. It says the spirits or the winds, whatever. That's why I say non-corporeal. And they formed it they formed the body out of matter. And then they transferred their consciousness into a material body. That's what that's saying. And then that sort of happened. And then I think something must have happened instinctively and intuitively. I feel this. And I think something must have happened between the first creation story and the second creation story, or we're just missing a lot of information. Because bear in mind, too, like a lot of the stuff that comprise the Bible, a lot of books have been taken out. Okay? It's just what whoever they are, felt was sufficient for us to have. So there's a lot of stuff that's been taken out. So bear that in mind as well, right? We're looking at things, we're trying to fill in gaps with understanding, and part of filling the gaps is understanding that there are gaps, right? And understanding, like, you could just, like, if you don't have something to fit into it, you don't try to force something to fit in the gap, you just recognize that there's a gap there. So there's clearly a gap between the first chapter and the second chapter. Now, the second chapter goes from referring to, I should say, first of all, the second chapter is structurally different from the first chapter. It actually reads like it was written by somebody completely different. And historians have argued and straight out said that it was written by somebody completely different, because energies, like, just the vibe is different. That's just how art is, right? Like, if you are a writer, like, you can tell what a Stephen King book, is, because it kind of sounds the same. He's not all of a sudden going to start writing about, like, something that's outside of what he normally writes about, for the most part. And if he does, venture out of it, it's still, you can tell it's a Stephen King, because that's just how art is. And the same thing when you're dealing with kind of human writers, right? Or I should say narrators. The narrative structure is different, right? And if you go on my TikTok versus like somebody else's TikTok, or my YouTube versus somebody else's YouTube, it's completely, I'm consistent, right? I basically talk about the same things consistently, more or less. Whether or not I build up on it or whatever it is, dissect it differently, but I'm talking about the same thing consistently. But my channel is going to be different from somebody who may look like me or maybe believe the same things I do, but their presentation is going to be different. And that's how you can tell it's two different entities. So when you read the first chapter and then you move to the second chapter, you can tell. And historians have said that these are two different writings. So the first one is more about order out of chaos, right? And it deals more with a temporal, a time dimension, right? So it's day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4. And it's more about the gods and what they are capable of, okay? Hold on, I need to get a drink. Now, the second chapter deals more with the story of mankind. And it's almost the opposite. It's a story about chaos from order, right? So you have an entity. This is a new entity because now the term Elohim is no longer used in the second chapter, in the second creation story. So every time from now on when I say second chapter, I mean the second creation story, okay? The term Elohim is no longer used. Elohim meaning plural of gods. And now the Lord God, or Yahweh Elohim, starts to be used. So that should tell you right then and there that you're talking about two different creations, okay? All right? I'll say that again. It switches in the second chapter from Elohim to Yahweh Elohim. Okay? So look at it this way. You can say the chapter 1 talks about the pantheon of the gods, right? Elohim. Okay? All of the gods, right? Male and female. And then we switch to chapter 2 and we talk about Yahweh of the gods, right? Yahweh Elohim, the Lord God, Yahweh Elohim. So that says like this is now like a member of the pantheon, and he decides to go into a specific region in space. So bear in mind, the first chapter deals more with time, okay, and the earth, right? The second chapter deals with a specific region in space. It actually even tells you exactly where it is, right? Where the Tigris and the Euphrates, it tells you there. So this entity, Yahweh, who is of the Elohim, yeah? So you think about, when you think Greek mythology, sorry guys, I'm not trying to have this be an ASMR. I'm just talking so much and I need to drink water. Okay, so you think about the pantheon of the Greek gods, right? You have, Hera, Zeus, Apollo, Poseidon, or whatever, right? So you have them. Or even specifically, you can even think about like the Titans, right? So you think about it like, let's say the Elohim are the Titans, okay? And then you have, like, let's say the first chapter deals with what the Titans created. And then you can say that the second, just to illustrate, the second chapter deals with what, like, let's say Zeus created, okay? Zeus of the Elohim. So Zeus is a god, right? Zeus is a god and he's like a son of the Titans. So he still falls under the category of a god, but he's something different, right? Zeus is different from the Titans, right? If you're familiar with Greek mythology or whatever. So I want you to apply that same mindset. It's from the same region, so this analogy definitely works, okay? So now you have Yahweh of the Elohim. And if you go back, even in English, you'll see that the first chapter, it says the God, or it says God, 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 even though it shouldn't say God, it should say the gods, but whatever. It says God, God. When it switches to the second chapter, all of a sudden it stops being God and it says the Lord God, the Lord God, the Lord God. And if you find the original Hebrew, the Lord God is actually Yahweh. Yahweh, Yahweh. So two different entities being described here. And it's not about these pantheon creating everything. It's about this one specific God, Yahweh, creating, sort of copying what the Elohim did and creating copying the same sort of creation. And the Gnostics that are listening to this right now are probably smirking, yeah? But it's all there. And is now creating sort of a micro kingdom, right? And in the Garden of Eden. So it goes from being kind of large and all about earth and creating man and woman, across the earth. And then the second chapter focuses on this Yahweh character just creating Adam and Eve. Okay. Now this is important because one, that is what the Gnostics believe, that the Yahweh in the Bible is actually not a good person. He's a false god, right? He's not the true terraformer, right? He's essentially like a usurper that is now wanting sort of credit for all of the things that the Elohim had created. Okay. And the Gnostics argue that this Yahweh guy is like also like kind of a dick. And that this world that he created is sort of a false world or whatever. It's not what things were supposed to be. So do with that information what you will. But back to what I'm talking about. So now you have this Yahweh character and you could tell he's not quite as powerful. Like if you read it, he seems almost like humanish, right? So you go from like stories of Titans being able to bend time and do all of these sort of things, right? And it's all very temporal, right? And they're terraforming everything. And then you shift to this guy that's like, this is the Yahweh guy now, right? So he creates man first and then he creates woman. Like, why wouldn't he create them at the same time? And in some, like in the Talmud, for example, they say that Yahweh had Adam first lay with all the other animals. So a little bit of bestiality going on. Like he doesn't seem like he knows what he's doing, to be perfectly honest. So he has them lay with all the animals first. This is Googleable. And by lay with, I mean bestiality. And then when that doesn't work, then he goes, oh, I guess I should probably like create a female or whatever. So he then takes a rib from Adam and then creates Eve. Two different creation stories, because the first chapter right, talks about men and women being created at the same time, and then consciousness being sort of uploaded into this clone. Something happened, there's a space, and now you have this dude that shows up and goes, let me create all these animals, okay, and then let me create like a man to kind of watch over the animals or whatever. And then he was like, it didn't even cross his mind to like, I should create a woman, with the man. And then he has the man like hook up with all these animals. Okay. And then he goes, oh, I guess maybe I should just create a female human. Like, even that is weird. Okay. Like, hello. All right. So then he creates a female, and then he, puts the tree of life and the tree of knowledge, which are metaphors, obviously, but he puts it in the garden. And these are all metaphors. Okay. So bear in mind that, okay, and share this because this is really good. Share this episode with all of your, friends that like this stuff. But bear in mind that the creations of the Elohim are still on earth at this moment. Keep that in mind, okay? The creations of the Elohim in the first chapter are still on earth. Now, in the second chapter, he creates Adam, and then he creates Eve, and then he puts a tree on there, and then there's like a serpent, and you guys know how it goes. Eve eats and then gives it to Adam, and then Yahweh shows up, and he's like walking. So Yahweh is, even though we believe it's supposed to be an all-knowing, all-powerful God, he's not really, because the first thing he says is, where are you? Right? Then he starts asking questions. And then he's like, did you eat from bro, you're supposed to be all knowing. Why are you asking me? Like, did you not see any of this coming? So he almost seems like he doesn't know what the hell he's doing. Right? Like, why would you put a tree of knowledge in the middle of this garden? Why would you put the tree of life in the middle of the garden? And specifically after they look at themselves, after Adam and Eve looks at themselves and go, okay, well, we're naked, and they feel the shame and cover themselves. Yeah. He then goes, we should, and there's that we again, we should probably move this tree of life now from the garden so that they being Adam and Eve, don't eat from the tree of life and then become like us, like me. Okay, which then tells you that it wasn't just Yahweh. That's why I like the comparison between the Elohim being the Titans and then Yahweh being like Zeus. Okay, so you might have a Yahweh who created like an Eden, but then that also means that there had to have been like a Shira who created like China or something like that, right? And I say that specifically because in a lot of like Chinese mythology, their god was a woman, right, that created them, whatever. So, but similar, making from clay, breathing earth, the same. Seems like that's the status quo. Yeah. So then they move the tree. He moves the tree and then has it guarded or whatever, and then sends Adam and Eve, off to, out of Eden or whatever. And here's like what's sort of interesting, because there's the implication there now that Adam and Eve, like they obviously have children. There are other people there. Read the story. Okay, there are other people around. And even when like the story of Cain and Abel happened and Cain becomes marked, he says to Yahweh, if you banish me from here, people will like harm me. They will kill me. And when you're reading that as a kid, you're like, who are the fucking people? Like, who are you talking about? Well, clearly that should tell you, one, that there were the humans that the Elohim had created, one, and then there have to be also sort of humans that Yahweh, and I would argue other entities like Yahweh, if you liken Yahweh to Zeus, then you could argue that, okay, like Hera created her own sort of Eden somewhere. Poseidon created his sort of own Eden somewhere, right? Aphrodite, Athena, whatever. So they're doing that. So they would have sort of clones and copies as well of humanoids. And so when Cain says, look, like if I go out and I'm like, I would get killed, that answers the question, right? So this story of the Garden of Eden speaks specifically about Yahweh's world, Yahweh's, Eden, right? Which is not to say that across the board, this wasn't happening across other continents as well. This sort of creation thing wasn't happening across the continents, other continents as well. I'm actually about to go as far as to say that when the Elohim were creating entities in their own image, knowing what I know about Greek mythology and talking about, what I said, I always want to say the theosophy, but it's not the theosophy. I wrote it down. Theogony by Hesiod. I actually would want to say that the first story, the chapter 1 Genesis could actually be describing like a similar sort of parallel of the Titans creating what we now think of as gods, right? So the Titans creating like the gods. Like, I think that would make the most sense, right? So the Titans created the gods, right? Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, whatever. And then the gods created us, right? And then the gods would be sort of more human than the Elohim, right? And the Elohim would basically be the oversoul, right? The collective consciousness that came forth, the non-corporeal entities that are, let's say they're a hive mind, and they came through, right? Through the wormhole. But then the argument there is that they could have been just like us. But like I said, sort of, I don't want to say evolved, but fuck it, evolved. You guys know what I mean. Evolved beyond the need of the body, right? Evolved beyond using the body. So now they become non-corporeal entities, cloned themselves as they used to be, transferred their consciousness into, these sort of humanoid forms, and then, I guess, fed them the tree of knowledge and the tree of life, right? Taught them right from wrong, right? And then allowed them to, give them a secret to immortality. And I think that's what's going on there. And then from that point on, right, think of Yahweh as like a Zeus, yeah, or a Hera, if you would like. But everyone's sort of in like creating their own sort of clone. So doing what the Elohim did to create them, right? So now we're their children, right? It's just like you would, create your own child, right? So now we're the children of God, the way the gods are the children of the Titans. All powerful, all the same thing. Now, what's the most telling? The most telling to me is that towards the end of the second chapter, when Yahweh says, let us now move the tree of life, yeah, from the humans and guard it so that they don't become like us, knowing good and evil. That is very telling, because that tells me, and I kind of said this on the TikTok, that tells me then that the only thing that differentiates like humans from gods, not the Elohim, but from Yahweh God, is knowledge of good and evil, which we've already eaten, right? And that to me is like basically judging right from wrong, because if you read on, you'll find that Yahweh guy was fucking drunk on that tree of knowledge, because he was a judge. He was so he's obviously very judgmental, like that whole Old Testament, like he's just judging this and judging that. And we are very much like that because we ate from that tree, right? Metaphorically, right? Because we learned, right? That was kind of passed on, right? When he breathed into us. And I say us loosely because I don't think that story applies to all humans, because once again, lost in translation, right? The story of Eden is only for those people in the Near East. It's their story. It's the Semitic people's origin story. So if what I said is accurate, okay, then perhaps across the world, right? You have Native Americans, you have Asians, all of that, indigenous people. They have their own origin story. And maybe just this Yahweh chose to mess about and sort of give that, allow his creations access to this tree. Clearly was a mistake, yeah? But that's not to say that all of the other children of the gods, which would be us across different societies, also partook. And that is very important. So I'm going to take that and kind of jump into the very next thing I'm going to discuss, which is I'm running out of time here, but we're going to keep going on. Okay, so to recap, Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 are two different creation stories. I have argued, at least towards the end, that the first one, let's just say we can use the Greeks as a cross-reference and say that the Elohim that were described in the first chapter of Genesis are essentially the Semitic equivalent of the Titans. Yeah, they were the first, right? And they always existed, and they were the terraformers, so to speak. And I would also argue that, quote, always existing in the sense of that they came from another reality, right? Where maybe their world was ending. And so now I'm pulling sort of science into this. And I'm saying that they were non-corporeal entities that sent DNA and all this information through a wormhole. And the end of their reality was the beginning of our reality, right? And then the story where they breathe into the physical forms of man and woman, right? Mankind or whatever, is actually a story of consciousness transfer into physical clones, right? So my previous episode, I talked about consciousness being the parasite. So the physical clones just being a vehicle body for which they could experience material form, right? And I think I also talked about, when all these creation stories say that they created the Elohim or the Titans or the gods or whatever created, gods from or mankind from earth, they really just mean from matter, right? So they took a non-corporeal entity and they breathed it into matter, right? And the only other thing you could use, is essentially, okay, what is matter? Well, you could call it earth, right? Material form, right? So there's that. Okay, so then kind of ended the last few minutes or whatever talking about now those were essentially the mankind that is defined in the first chapter of Genesis could actually be discussing the gods. So we're using Greek again, the Greeks or Greek mythology again as a cross-reference because they sort of originated in that same area. So it works, right? To kind of understand their ideology a little bit better. So now you have the Titans who kind of, gave birth to the gods. And then you have in Genesis, you have the Elohim, which then gave birth to the Yahweh. So then in the second chapter, we now have Yahweh, and it's very specific to a particular region, which is telling you, the reader, that the story of Eden is an origin story of the Semitic people, of the ancient Israelites. They're not thinking about the Chinese. They're not thinking about the Africans. It's their story, because at the time that it was written, they were probably only really aware of themselves, right? Every culture that writes a story about how they came to be, even though there are similarities from culture to culture, the Chinese aren't writing a story about how Africans came to be. The Chinese are writing stories about how the Chinese came to be. And so are, the Iroquois, Native Americans, and they're writing their own story about how they came to be. So are the Igbos, so are the, Yorubas, right? They're writing their story. It's their gods, the same with the Nords, Nordic people, right? And the Norse mythology, it's their story. So while we tend to and we have been programmed to adopt the narrative of Adam and Eve, as Adam and Eve being like our forefathers. As an African, that doesn't make any sense. That's not the story of our, quote, Yahweh-esque kind of, gods. It's specifically Yahweh created those humanoids or those humans, I should say, in that particular region. And so what I was saying was that it seems to me that, this Yahweh person wasn't as all powerful as like the Titans, right? The Elohim. Yeah. And he kind of made a lot of like blunders. And it also seems like the sort of the understanding what you're supposed to glean from that is that Yahweh was basically us. That's it. Yahweh was basically us, right? So the Elohim, when they created the gods are us. We are gods. The difference is judgment and eternal life. Although I could argue, and I have argued, that you do live for all eternity. So then basically the fact that you are told that, you are immortal and you haven't eaten from the tree of life, that within itself is a type of deception. Because literally every other culture, I can even speak specifically for Africans, they believe that when you die, you carry on as your ancestors. Okay. So maybe there's a guilt issue there or whatever, but even in the Bible, the biblical understanding is that when you die, you'll be judged, right? So how can you be judged after you die if you're not going to live forever, right? And then it says that you'll, there's heaven and things like that. So there's places you can go to after, death. So that within itself is a meh sort of situation. But I want you to really start to understand that the story of Eden and Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel, those are the first of the Semitic people in that region, the Israelites, their story, which what you should take from that is then there are beings just like Yahweh. So bear in mind that Yahweh, the hierarchy where Yahweh is somewhat saying we should worship him, that is a false hierarchy if you're looking at it from an objective and from an outsider's perspective, because the only thing that differentiates Yahweh from Adam and Eve was that Yahweh was judgmental, which then they became judgmental because they partook of the tree. And Yahweh also could, live forever, was immortal, which because he breathed his consciousness into them, right, so that they could become living being, that was not a technology that he was familiar with. Right? That's somebody else's technology. But by doing that, they are immortal, right? Because consciousness is now in them. And bear in mind what I said in my previous episode, right? Every time you reincarnate, okay, you take on the persona and you believe that you are this and that and the other. But then when you die, your consciousness carries on, right? Same mind, same consciousness, just a different body. So the simple fact that you are conscious and you have consciousness or soul, whatever you want to call it, within you means that you cannot die. And so you had the Elohim that was consciousness, a hive mind. And once the Elohim breathed into Yahweh became like identified with the ego of Yahweh, just like us. Okay, so, and I'm sure you probably maybe not have heard this, but if you think about it, it makes sense. So then we aren't children of Yahweh, right? Yahweh might have essentially done whatever he needed to do to sort of create, entities that he could dominate. But this is straight out of the book of Gnostics. This is what the Gnostics were trying to say. The Yahweh was a false god, right? He's not really a god. We're no different from him, okay? Even him putting guard against the tree of life, if you think about it, how can a tree of life, like give you life when you are life. You are consciousness, right? So the same breath that was breathed into Yahweh to give him life, right, is the same breath that he breathed into Adam and Eve to give them life. And I would argue that the same sort of creation was happening, across the continents. And then this false sort of dichotomy came through where then these entities decided, well, because I gave life to, these, humanoids or whatever that are basically them, because I created them, they should worship me. And therein lies the problem, right? So, for example, you'll see this happening with parents and children and all, across all cultures. Parents go, well, I gave birth to you, so you need to do what I say. You didn't do shit. You had sex, right? And then the body did the work because it's a machine, it's a vehicle. And then it put out a child. But the child, the consciousness, the mechanism in which the consciousness was uploaded into the body, you didn't have shit to do with that. And more importantly, you're not the originator of the child's consciousness, right? The consciousness always exists. It just now has taken on a new form. But we dominate our children as though we own them because we birthed them. And so we, quote, created them. And that's bullshit. So the same thing was what Yahweh was thinking. Well, I created you. No, you didn't. You were using a pre-existing technology to essentially manifest this Adam and Eve, but they were just a physical form. Once he breathed into Adam and Eve, the transfer of consciousness, they became Adam and Eve. They adopted this persona of Adam and Eve. Right? And then he said, worship me. That's fucked up. Okay, that's why the Gnostics have an issue with Yahweh. Okay? The tree of knowledge was not a tree of knowledge. It was a tree of knowledge of good and evil, which was basically just means to say, okay, this is good and this is bad. That is judgment. It's a tree that teaches judgment. And it should have been forbidden, not because it means that they would die. That was a lie. Consciousness cannot die. It meant that what they were and who they were, the understanding, the knowledge of what they were, and the fact that they were, eternal beings, who they were, consciousness, would die. That knowledge would die. See, if you study and you pay attention to Yahweh, he ate from the tree. Seems like it wasn't something that he should have been doing either. And he kind of got lost in his ego and fully identified with form because he forgot by being judgmental. Now I'm bringing Eastern philosophy into this, okay? By being judgmental, by being attached to form and saying this is good and this is bad, his ego crystallized and he became Yahweh and forgot that he was consciousness. And then he sought to sublimate others. So the tree of life, the tree of knowledge was not something, that was a truth in that sense, right? The tree of knowledge was not something, knowledge of good and evil was not something that should have been consumed. Whether or not the tree, that being taught that, okay, this is good and this is bad, is a good thing or, a bad thing, that's up for discussion, but I would say that it's not a good thing. It's not about ignorance. It's about judgmental, right? It's not about ignorance because it wasn't a tree of knowledge. It was a tree of knowledge of good and evil. They're two different things. Now, the snake comes through, and I'm tempted to think that the snake is really just a reptilian race. I mean, look, we're there already, but I'm tempted to think that the snake were a reptilian race that maybe existed in this formless earth when the Elohim showed up, or maybe they just were, created by like a reptilian sort of version of Yahweh, right? So you have Yahweh who's creating, humanoids out of like ape descendants, and then you have the snake, right? The serpent who comes through, and he's saying, no, you should judge, right? And he says, I will teach you to be civil. I will teach you civilization or whatever. And it almost sounds like this civilization, they're much more technologically advanced, and they're basically doing they did to Adam and Eve and, that region, right? What, it seems like what Adam and Eve and the descendants of Adam and Eve do to other regions as well. They'll go to I'll come back to this, but they'll go to like another person's country and say, you should not live with nature. You should not, eat from the trees and, and just exist with nature. This is wrong and this is right. Yeah. So I think that reptile isn't actually a snake. I think it literally is discussing or might be describing a reptilian race that, consciousness has been uploaded into reptilian humanoid kind of forms, or perhaps they just existed on Earth when the Elohim came through. Like, you got to think deeper about this stuff. You know what I mean? Like, stop taking things literally and start looking at it like metaphorically, like it's telling us a hidden story here. Now, the reason why I say that, and then that would explain obviously why, all of what I just said would explain why when Cain, made the sacrifice or whatever, there were other people. And even when Adam and Eve left Eden, it does talk about there being other people, because Yahweh was not the only child of Elohim that was on earth. Which then would say that all of the gods that had sort of ruled, across the different regions around the world were essentially like related in a way to Yahweh. But once again, what I'm saying is, if you have the breath of the Elohim in you, then you have consciousness in you, right? And you have life. Then you are already immortal. And then the only thing that separates you from the God is the ability to judge. And you'll see that in all creation myths and all stories, the gods are extremely judgmental. I mean, that's where they get their powers, which is decrying things as good and evil. But other than that, that's the similarity. We're similar. So then the whole notion, I apologize, but the whole notion of worshiping an entity that has the same consciousness as you have and the same immortality that you have, but just has decided that how you live and who you are is wrong and is judging you. That's it. That's the only power that they have over you, is to judge. To worship that seems kind of sus. Okay, so this episode is going to be called God's Bellybutton, because people asked me in a couple of lives ago, does God have a belly button? And I liked the question. And the answer to that was yes. The Yahweh that most Westerners worship as God would have a belly button, because to kind of pull it all together, when the Elohim came through to Earth and they terraformed the planet and then made clones of their former physical selves, right? Then they clearly would need, right? They clearly, when they uploaded their consciousness into, physical forms, then it would be corporeal, right? So it was a non-corporeal entity transferring its consciousness or uploading its consciousness into a physical form, right? Now, if we're using science, right, as the point of reference, then, and I'm saying that the first gods, right, and I would even argue the first gods were actually the first people. But the first gods were the first people who were aware of what was really going on, which is what made them God, right? Or gods, right? Was knowledge. You hear me? It was knowledge and understanding of what the nature of this reality is. And the understanding that it's consciousness that makes them immortal. Right? It's not the physical form. The physical form is just a thing. If we're saying that they are using technology, then they probably obviously use clones, and you need to feed like a clone at least my present understanding, through some sort of umbilical cord at the very least, right? Even if it's on some sort of like, in the future where they show that human beings stop having kids and they now grow them, but there's still, the mechanism to feed a fetus is through the umbilical cord, because that's just the nature of the physical form of the human body, right? In order to grow a baby, right, that's what the belly button is for. It's that umbilical cord for it to get sustenance, because it cannot yet process food through the mouth, right? Chew and all that as it's developing. So that's my only sort of understanding of how cloning works. So from my limited understanding, if that was the case, then yes, they would, even if it was a non-corporeal form, uploading its consciousness into a physical body. The physical body had to be prepared first. And my guess is if it's created in a lab or something like that, there would need to be still a way to feed the fetus until it becomes fully grown. So it would have a belly button. That's even like a super weird, like sci-fi answer to that, but it's true. Like it would have a belly button. Yeah, because how else would you feed the fetus? But to say that, you also have to understand that when they say gods or the gods, it's not talking about, none of the stories are talking about the physical manifestations of the gods, because they're just in vehicles, right? In the previous episode, I used the analogy of a symbiote, and I kind of brought up the show Stargate, and how essentially the symbiote is like the god, but they just take on the bodies, and they kind of hijack the bodies of whatever their the Goa'uld or whatever forms that they sort of live through. And I'm saying that's what consciousness is. So God, Yahweh, would have a physical form, would have a physical body, would have a physical vehicle, right? It's almost like saying, would the first person to walk on, the moon or whatever, have had a sort of life support system, like an air system? Yes, because that's part of the function of the suit, of the space suit. Like it needs to provide air, right, to the being that's within the suit. But to glorify the suit as the astronaut is goofy, right? Because it's the entity in the suit that is more important, right? That is the astronaut. So you really got to keep playing with the idea of separating consciousness from form. So the first gods would have been the Elohim, who had transferred their consciousness into the physical forms of a male and a female, right? And then the second gods, which would be human beings, would have been the same thing, formed from matter, I'm guessing grown in the lab, and then consciousness transferred into the physical form. So yes, they would. Now, bear in mind everything that I've been talking about, and let's go back to the Fertile Crescent, to the Near East, to east of Eden, which was like the Iran area, whatever, which is where Cain was sort of banished to, right? The Caucasus Mountains. Now, what I'm about to say is from the story Ishmael, and I believe it's by Daniel Quinn. If you haven't read it, I suggest please check it out. It's very interesting. It's one of those books that when you read it, it just expands something, just breaks little things in your brain. And essentially what the author said is that in the Bible, when you have Cain and Abel, right, the brothers, so Abel presents an offering of like lamb, like meat to Yahweh, yeah? And by Yahweh, I'm not using Yahweh in what I've just kind of basically said, like with the understanding of how like a Gnostic would look at Yahweh. The people who wrote of Yahweh didn't see Yahweh the way I see Yahweh. Kind of like the way we in our present time discuss and talk about Zeus being like a total, like a horrible husband and a whore, like, you know what I mean? But that's our modern interpretation. So when those people spoke about Yahweh, they obviously they put some respect on his name, okay? Which is not what I'm doing, especially with this episode, because I'm just looking at it from an objective perspective. But when Abel presented meat, and Cain presented essentially the fruits of his labor, or fruits of agriculture. Okay, and even the story of, because they started judging things as good and bad, Adam and Eve. What that basically is saying is that the people who wrote those stories are basically saying that their first man and first woman, they messed up by judging. Okay, I guess let me rephrase that. No, I'll say what I'm saying. So, they're the first man and woman of their culture, and Daniel Quinn argues that story isn't even written about the ancient Semites. It's actually written about the Caucasians. But that's his argument. I don't, that's why I said read the book and form your own conclusions. But that's what he's saying. But I'm just looking at it straightforward. What the story there is saying is that once they ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, once they began judging how other people were living, right? And they looked around and they felt like we should not have to be subject to the demands and whims of the gods, right? Then they were essentially cursed, and essentially it became, okay, fine. If you don't want to trust for the gods to provide food and nourishment and everything like that, that was Eden, right? Eden had the plan, so you could have just eaten freely, right? And they chose to eat from the fruit. They chose to judge that life of hunter and gatherers, right? That's what that story is about. Okay? So you have Eden, which is basically that region, right? And you have food everywhere. And so Adam and Eve, they are representative of the people in that region who were born into the region, and they sort of walked around like what we, and by we, I don't mean us. I mean like what Western thinkers would call savages, right? They walked around naked or whatever, but they weren't ashamed. They lived in accordance with nature, and they ate what they could eat, right? Ate fruit or whatever, and they didn't really, they protected, they were shepherds and things of that nature, but they were part of nature. And then they ate from the tree of judgment. Let's call it that. It's not a tree of knowledge of good and evil. Let's just break it down to what it is. It's a tree of judgment. And then they became corrupted, maddened, like their predecessors, the gods, deciding this is good and this is bad. And once they began to judge, they judged all the other humans that were just like them, right? That were created by, let's call them, the gods, right? So Elohim are the Titans, and then you have the gods, right? Yahweh being one of them, Asherah being another, right? So all of these other gods that kind of emerge at those times are still, they're human beings. You need to bear that in mind. When I say God, I don't want you thinking of like some dude in the sky. Think of them as human beings. If you got to watch a few episodes of Stargate, do that. Anubis, all of that. They were human beings that were created by the Titans. So I keep calling the Elohim the Titans so that you can mentally start to kind of draw the images. But they were human beings that were created by the Titans. They just happen to be immortal or whatever. That's it. And so they were judgmental and they were immortal. And I would argue that the immortality had more to do with maybe what physical forms, the longevity of their physical forms, not even them themselves, right? The longevity of their physical forms, okay? The how long their vehicles lasted. That's it. Because their consciousness that the gods had is the same consciousness that you have, but your physical form doesn't last that long, right? 100-something years max. But even in the Bible, you'll see that the humans in that time, even Adam and Eve and Cain, they lived for a really long time. Okay, so and then their lives began for whatever reason. I guess when you start judging things as good and bad, you sort of lose your health and you break down over time. I don't know if that's what it's telling us or what they're trying to say. Okay, so we're all gods. That's it. That's all basically I'm saying. We're all children of the Elohim. We all have contained within us the same breath that was in Yahweh is the same breath that he put in us. So we're all the same. It's just our physical vehicles are a little bit less, they don't last as long. That's it. But that has nothing to do with the consciousness that's within you. It's just a vehicle. The body's just a vehicle. Okay? So what the story is saying is that Adam and Eve, right, they ate from the tree of judgment. And then they decided that the way all the other humanoids around them were living was wrong. And they decided that to live in accordance with nature was wrong. So they grabbed nature, they grabbed plants and began to clothe themselves and to cover themselves. Okay? Then they started tilling the earth, right? So it wasn't about God providing anymore. They were like, we will conquer the earth. And then that's when agriculture came. Okay, so everything that troubles us now in this world, in our reality, stems from agriculture. I talked about this on there's one of my lives or whatever, or not lives, one of my videos I called The Loop, and I talk about, and then they develop agriculture. Agriculture seems to be the root cause of literally all evils, as we understand it now. The development of agriculture. Okay, so that's what the story of Adam and Eve is about. And then Cain and Abel. So what the people who wrote that story, they're basically saying is that Abel and Cain are two different tribes. Abel represents the tribes of hunter-gatherers, nomads, who just sort of trust that nature, right, the earth or whatever, or God, the gods, whatever, will provide, right? Cain, when he presented fruit, he was a farmer. And what the writers were saying is that the reason why the gods rejected Cain's offering was because essentially Cain was saying, I don't need you to provide. I can provide for myself. Now do with that information what you will. I think it's fascinating. And so he was rejected. And now the author goes further as far as to say that when he was marked, the mark of Cain was the whiteness of his skin. And that there was a specific group of people from the Caucasus Mountain, which if you read in the Bible, it said east of Nod. That was where Cain was banished, to east of Nod. And I looked on the map, and that east of Nod, I actually looked east of where Eden was supposed to be, which they give a specific location in Genesis. It says like around where the Tigris and the Euphrates meet. So it tells you specifically where it is. So I took off a map and I just looked north, south, west, east, and I just looked east, and that's the Indo-European region, basically. Okay? That was where Cain was banished. And it's interesting because as Cain is leaving, he also says if I stumble across people, they'll kill me. And he says, no, and then Yahweh says, you won't be killed. I've marked you, and blah, 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 whatever. And anybody reading that would go, who are the people that are going to kill him? If it's just his mom and his dad, and I feel like I've addressed that in this very long podcast episode, but it's profound. If I do say so myself, and I'm not patting myself on the back, it's just pulling all these ideas together is fascinating, and it's not coming directly from me, right? It's all of these ideas that have happened across, and I'm just putting it together into one sort of narrative story to kind of get things, easier to grasp. So that's what the story of Cain and Abel is about. It's not that God was not a carnivore, right? He didn't hate vegans, or I should say Yahweh was not a carnivore. He didn't hate vegans. What the writers in the story are trying to illustrate is that a rejection of the agriculture phenomenon, because Cain is basically saying, I don't need God to provide for me. I will provide for myself, which was a violation of, I guess, the laws, right? That all the other animals follow, right? So stuff to think about there. Definitely stuff to think about. But I hope what you've gotten from this episode is now, pulling everything together, understanding that when they discuss the Elohim, think of them as, every time you see, the Elohim in the Bible, or if you can pull up the ancient, like Hebrew or whatever, and cross-translate, they're talking about, think of like a Titan type of beings, but take that even a step further. And I'm just saying Titan, just more of, because a lot of Titans were also non-physical, believe it or not. I think 6 of the Titans were non-physical. So think of it as consciousness, right? So the Elohim were non-corporeal entities, right? Just pure consciousness, right? And then they came, terraformed the earth, and then started cloning themselves and transferring the consciousness into form. But what happens every time you take on a new incarnation, right? A lot of the time you identify as, okay, Joe or John or Tom or whatever, right? And that's what happened. So Yahweh got lost on his own sense of self-importance. But that's not the nature of this world. Anything that has consciousness is just like God. So you cannot die. Consciousness cannot die. Energy cannot die. It can only change form. Hello. Is this thing on? Yes. Okay. So, very, very fascinating stuff. I'm gonna check my notes. You're gonna hear some wrinkling, just make sure I didn't forget anything. But yeah, definitely you want to check out. Read the book, Ishmael. You don't have to agree with everything the author is saying, but it's a different perspective and something to think about. It's a different approach. And revisit this episode and share it, because I personally have not heard Genesis described in this way, and I would even take a step further now. So every god, right, falls under the category. Even Zeus and Hera and all of them, they're just human. That's it. They're all just human. And you could tell because they keep mating with humans, right? Common sense. They are humans just like us. Hello. I should say it's their consciousness that is a quote God. And the only thing that they have over us is the understanding and the knowledge that they are just like us. But it's like you think about the royal family or all the kings and queens, right? They're just like us, but for some reason they're venerated. Why is that? Where does that come from? Right? It's obviously an ideology, a mindset that has been passed on for a very long time, where humankind keeps worshiping other human beings who possess the same level of consciousness as you do. But for some reason, they've just kind of said, no, I'm more important than you, and worship me, and then we just do. But like Queen Elizabeth shits, burps, and, farts just like you do. Right? So we need to stop that shit. But we're all gods. And we're all gods in the sense that we're all consciousness. Right? And we're all consciousness existing within a physical form. The exact same way that all of the gods do and did. Because another thing that is consistent is that all of the gods and all of the creation myths across all the cultures also mate with the human beings. You can't have that happen and bear children unless they're both physical forms. So when they say gods, then it's all this says is just a hierarchy, the same way we talk about kings and queens and rulers. That's it. That's all that is. Period. That's all that is. It's a false sense of hierarchy, but that's what it is across the board. Across the board. So, even that goes as far as to say now when you read and talk about the sons of God, and we call them the Nephilim, if you break down the original translation, they're essentially just great men. Right? So, like, let's say, Hercules. He was they call him the demigod, right? Because he was the son of God and a man, right? So he was a demigod, right? But he was just a human being, right? And he died, right? Or whatever, right? And there's another book, The Origin of Consciousness by Julian Jaynes, and he talks about how, for a while you had people who, when a king died, they just sort of worshipped and venerated his grave, and then they put in like his sculptures of him, and then that's how kind of God sort of came about. But they were, what we think of as gods were just great rulers. That's it. And the translation supports everything that I'm saying. So even the sons of gods were just they were just princes. That's it. That's it. Anyway, thanks for listening. These are always fun to do. Got some really cool episodes coming over the next couple of weeks. I got a bunch of books. We're going to be talking about ancestral trauma. We're going to be talking about, DNA and what the information that it holds and the memories that it holds from previous, your ancestors. So your mind holding information from, or your consciousness holding information from your previous and future incarnations, but also your body holding information from your ancestors. And could you theoretically tap into the talents of your ancestors? All right, something to think about.